There is a fraud so vast it fooled the entire world, and its stain reached all the way to the Grammy stage. The award was handed over, celebrated, and then in a moment of historic shame it was violently ripped away. But if a 2021 survey shows that 68% of today's music listeners have no idea this scandal ever happened, does it still carry any lesson for us? Perhaps the greatest victims were not the famous faces, but the silent, real singers hidden behind the curtain. In 1988, a pop duo was assembled in Munich, Germany, and the world was introduced to Fab Morvan and Rob Pilatus, a pair whose image was manufactured with meticulous precision. The Encyclopedia Britannica chronicles their formation, but the real story begins with a producer who wanted to build a product, not a band. That producer, Frank Farian, didn't just discover them, he created them, writing every song himself with collaborators like Peter Bischoff-Fallenstein, a detail that contradicts the public's romanticized view of the duo as artists. So when you picture them on stage, you are picturing a carefully engineered illusion, a vessel for the talent that was invisible to the public eye. A startling 2021 YouGov survey revealed that roughly 68% of today's music listeners are completely unaware of this massive deception, a fact that raises a chilling question. If the scandal is being forgotten, are we doomed to repeat its mistakes? This isn't just a footnote in pop culture, it's a case study in how a manufactured reality can be sold to millions, convincing them that they are witnessing authentic artistry. Now consider the story of Charles Shaw, a session singer whose voice became the very foundation of this constructed empire. The Guardian chronicled how he was recruited into a world of absolute secrecy, bound by agreements that made him a ghost within the very music he helped create. He was the musical soul behind the vibrant image, one of the many hidden vocalists who were paid to be anonymous and then told to disappear. The core of this story is that the duo was not just a pair of performers. They were a branded product, engineered from the ground up by a team that understood the machinery of the music industry. The name on the album cover was a trademark, while the voices filling the radio waves came from men whose identities were deemed too plain to sell. They were the legions the crowd cheered for, but from the very first note, not a single sound came from their lips. It was a perfect deception, a synthesized hit that used human bodies as the visual component for an entirely different vocal reality. This is the engine of the product, using marketable people to sell music you can't create with them. The world remembers Milli Vanilli as a duo, but the voice they heard on the radio was never just one man. It was a carefully layered construction, a vocal Frankenstein stitched together from at least 3 distinct session singers, Brad Howell, John Davis and Charles Shaw. Each man lent his throat to different tracks, their individual tones blended and matched to create the seamless sound that topped the charts. To keep this illusion airtight, Charles Shaw and his fellow studio vocalists were forced into ironclad non-disclosure agreements. These contracts legally prohibited them from ever publicly claiming the songs they had poured their souls into, effectively silencing them for years under the threat of ruin. They were the architects of a massive musical monument, yet they were condemned to wander its hallways as ghosts, never allowed to take credit for a single brick. These session singers recorded the entire album, their voices immortalized on vinyl, but their names were deliberately omitted from the sleeve. This erasure was not an accident, but a standard ruthless industry practice, designed to keep the product clean and the secrets safe from prying eyes. Even in an era known for its manufactured pop, this level of anonymity was a profound and damaging erasure of their professional identity. Perhaps the most painful detail emerged when Charles Shaw revealed that he was once denied entry to a Milli Vanilli concert's backstage area. The management feared that fans might recognize the face behind the voice they idolized, a single glance threatening to shatter the entire multi-million-dollar facade in an instant. Can you imagine the crushing weight of that moment? Being the actual talent yet treated as a contagion, to be hidden away from the very audience your voice was drawing in. They were the beautiful sound, and they were made to be invisible. They sang the songs that made the world dance, but they were not permitted to exist in the same room as their own creation. Their reward was not fame or fortune, but the silent, suffocating knowledge that their greatest work would forever belong to someone else's face. $2,000 per song. That was the entire fortune Charles Shaw earned for lending his voice to one of the biggest pop records of the decade, while Rob Pilatus and Fab Morvan were raking in millions of dollars in royalties, advances, and touring income. It is a number that feels almost insulting when you place it next to the sheer scale of the success it helped create, a sum that makes the gap between the people on stage and the people on the record feel less like a difference in pay and more like a difference in species. You have to wonder what exactly the going rate is for giving up your identity so that two other men can become stars, and whether anyone in that studio ever paused to consider that the voice they were buying for pocket change was worth more than the entire machine they were feeding. The lawyer for Charles Shaw later revealed that his client had not seen a single cent in royalties from the album sales, despite the fact that the record he sang on was the best-selling album of the year. The record in question, Girl You Know It's True, sold over 7 million copies in the United States alone, piling up platinum certifications that the men who actually performed the vocals would never see reflected in their bank accounts. In 1990, the average session singer could expect to earn somewhere between $40 and $50 an hour for their work in the studio, a respectable living for a working musician, but a staggering nothing when compared to the hundreds of thousands of dollars that frontmen of successful bands could pull in annually from touring and record sales. You could fill a stadium with the people who bought that album. You could count the millions of dollars it generated, and you could still not find the name of the man who made it all possible on a single receipt. Charles Shaw was threatened with a lawsuit when he tried to step forward, not because he had done something wrong, but because his very existence was a legal liability to the men who had built a fortune on his vocal cords. The fear of exposure made him a prisoner of his own silence, a man who had to watch the world celebrate a lie while he was told that telling the truth would cost him everything he had left. To understand the scale of the injustice, you have to strip away the bright lights and the sequined jackets and look at the raw economics of the whole operation, because that is where the real crime sits. The men who wrote the checks collected the glory, and the man who sang the songs was told to be grateful for the crumbs that fell his way, and that was the entire deal. Here is the question that never gets asked because the scandal is always framed as a story of two frauds getting caught. What does it mean when a labourer builds a product that enriches everyone except themselves? And where exactly does that leave the value of their work? You can dress it up in talk of fame and exposure and the privilege of being in the room. But when you add up the numbers, the picture is brutally simple. Charles Shaw made the world rich. He made Rob and Fab rich. He made Frank Farian rich. And in exchange, he received a flat fee that would not even cover a month of rent in the city where the industry made its deals. The album sold millions. The singles topped the charts. The tour sold out. And the voice that carried all of it was paid once and then forgotten. It is a depressing calculation when you realise that his slice of the pie was not a slice at all, but a single crumb that fell from a table he was not even allowed to sit at. The follow-up album was planned with the same formula, the same studio musicians, the same invisible labour, and the same expectation that these men would be paid a wage while swallowing the entire record. You start to understand that this was not a moment of individual greed, but a well-oiled system designed to extract maximum value from the people who had the most talent and the least power. When the story broke, everyone rushed to point fingers at the men who moved their lips. But nobody stopped to ask why the man who actually sang was never considered part of the conversation. The sharpest lesson of the Milli Vanilli mess is not about the fakeness of the performance. It is about the fakeness of the entire economic structure that treated the voice as a cheap commodity and the image as the only thing worth protecting. Brad Howell and the other studio singers walked away with their flat fees. Frank Farian walked away with a company, and the two men in the spotlight walked away with the record-breaking sales. Charles Shaw was the ghost in the machine, and the machine did not even give him the dignity of a proper haunting, because every time he tried to appear, he was pushed back into the shadows. He made the art, he made the hits, he made the entire thing possible, and yet the only thing he could call his own was the anger of a man who had been used and then discarded. And that is the twist that nobody sees coming. The man who sang the songs was the only one in the entire operation who was never allowed to be a star, a fact that makes a mockery of the word fairness. So the next time you hear a perfect pop song on the radio, you might want to ask yourself who actually sang it and who actually got paid, because the two answers might be very different people. Frank Farian was not some accidental fraudster who stumbled into deception. He was a German producer who had already perfected this exact trick more than a decade earlier, when he built the legendary 1970s group Boney M. on the very same foundation of studio voices hidden behind performing faces. The BBC noted in 2024 that his method was consistent: record real singers in the studio, then put attractive bodies on stage to mime it all. This was not a crime of passion or a moment of weakness, but a deliberate, repeatable business model that he refined over 2 decades. The twist is that Farian himself was the one who finally pulled the trigger on exposing the whole operation. In 1990, he told The Telegraph that he decided to reveal the scandal because he felt personally betrayed when Rob and Fab demanded to actually sing on their next album, a request he flatly refused. Think about that for a second. The man who built the lie felt betrayed by the 2 men who wanted to make it real. He would rather destroy everything than let the mask slip, a move that reveals his true priority was never art, but absolute control over his product. What makes Farian so chilling is that he carried this attitude all the way to his grave. Reports after his death in January 2024, as covered by the BBC, made it clear that he never expressed a single ounce of regret, because he always viewed Milli Vanilli as a purely commercial product and nothing more. Meanwhile, the real voice behind Rob Pilatus, Charles Shaw, told The Guardian in 2023 that he did not randomly end up in that studio. He was introduced by another musician and worked with Farian in Germany under conditions of absolute secrecy, hidden from the public eye. So ask yourself, when an artist calls their work a product and the people involved tools, what exactly is left of the art itself? The punchline of this whole operation is that Farian was utterly consistent and utterly unapologetic, and that consistency is precisely what makes him monstrous. To him, the deception was never a mistake. It was the entire point, and the singers were just interchangeable parts in a machine he owned. To understand what happened to Rob Pilatus and Fab Morvan, you have to stop seeing them as masterminds and start seeing them as trapped men. Robert Pilatus was born in 1965 and grew up in an orphanage in Munich, Germany, after being abandoned by his parents, a beginning that hardly primes someone to resist the lure of a record deal. Fab Morvan and Rob later revealed that their contract with Arista Records, headed by Clive E. Davis, contained a clause that explicitly forbade them from singing without the label's permission. The world saw 2 confident dancers commanding the stage, but the reality was that they did not sing a single word on the album they were contracted to promote, only moving and lip-syncing at every appearance. This arrangement turned them into puppets, where every smile was a performance, and every hit song was a reminder that their own voices were considered worthless by the men who profited. When the mask finally slipped, the public's fury landed entirely on their shoulders. Yet who had the power to say no when your entire identity and future depended on obeying a corporate machine? Imagine the psychological weight of living a lie so massive that your very existence on stage was a fraud, with no way out that didn't mean total annihilation. The pressure became unbearable, and on April 2, 1998, Rob Pilatus died in Frankfurt, Germany, from an overdose of alcohol and prescription pills at just 32 years old, with police treating the case as a suicide. They were both victims and perpetrators, but while the public demanded accountability for the deception, it was Rob who paid the ultimate price with his life. For anyone wanting to understand the human cost behind such public unravelings, a crucial step is organising a conversation about mental health, not to excuse the deception, but to comprehend the crushing forces that drive people to such desperate ends. This means inviting a licensed psychologist who specialises in trauma and career pressure, creating a safe space where the audience can process how systemic coercion leads to personal destruction. The lesson here is not that Rob and Fab were evil, but that they were individuals crushed by a system that valued their image over their humanity. And the real tragedy is that we only remember the fraud. The Grammy stage in 1990 was supposed to be the ultimate validation, the moment Milli Vanilli officially became untouchable. The New York Times recorded that night as the duo took home the award for Best New Artist, cementing their status as pop royalty. But 11 months later, the unthinkable happened. The Recording Academy made history by formally revoking the honour, a first-ever action for the institution. That public humiliation was set in motion on November 14, 1990, when producer Frank Farian held a press conference and admitted Rob and Fab had not sung a single note on any of their records. The fallout was so seismic that the award was then handed to Mariah Carey in 1991, a shift that felt less like a coronation and more like a desperate correction. Consider the sheer gravity of what was stripped away, not just in gold-plated hardware, but in cultural permanence. A trophy that was supposed to represent artistic merit had been exposed as a hollow prop, and the industry was forced to confront its own complicity in the fraud. This was not a small clerical error or a misunderstood contract. It was a complete breakdown of the trust between the audience and the institution meant to certify excellence. When the Recording Academy admitted it had been fooled, the message was clear. Even the highest altar of musical achievement could be profaned. The fact that Mariah Carey inherited the win adds an almost poetic layer, as if the system was desperately trying to scrub the stain clean with a legitimate superstar. Now, let's pause and ask yourself a difficult question. If an institution as powerful as the Grammys can be so completely deceived, why do we continue to treat these awards as infallible markers of truth? We craft entire essays around prestige, building arguments on the assumption that a laurel means authenticity, when this entire saga proves the opposite. To write a balanced essay on this, you must first analyse the historical context, weighing the recorded events of 1990 against the retrospective interviews that followed in the years after. Then, you present the opposing viewpoints, the fans who felt personally betrayed, the label executives who claimed ignorance, and the artists who were caught in the crossfire. Only by laying out these conflicting perspectives side by side can you show how institutional power can be both the shield and the sword of deception. This was not just a personal scandal for Rob and Fab, it was a wound carved into the very concept of institutional validation. For Fab Morvan, the years that followed became a stark before and after study, where the man who was once the face of a Grammy winner had to rebuild his identity from the ashes of an unforgivable lie. He had tasted the highest honour, only to have it violently ripped away in a public spectacle that no amount of subsequent success could fully erase. That memory of the world laughing at him, of the trophy being physically taken back, is a stain that outlasts any glory. A prize can be revoked, a statue can be returned, but the haunting image of that fall is a permanent resident in the mind. When the truth about Milli Vanilli detonated in late 1990, the reaction wasn't just disappointment, it was a full-blown cultural firestorm that demanded blood and money. By 1991, frustrated fans had escalated their anger into organised protests, some even marching on radio stations to demand refunds for the very airtime that had pumped the duo's hits into their home. The Federal Trade Commission stepped in during that same period, launching an investigation that forced Milli Vanilli to refund concert ticket prices to fans who had paid to see a show that was never real. But the financial carnage didn't stop at the box office, because concert promoters who had fronted massive stage production costs were also ordered to recoup their losses, pushing insurance companies to the brink as they absorbed the unprecedented claims. Just 12 months after the scandal broke, the duo's desperate comeback album Rob and Fab crashed and burned, leaving them drowning in debt to their own record label and management. This wasn't just a broken heart. It was a legal and financial avalanche that buried everyone caught in its path, proving that public fury has a price tag. When the crowd turned away, they didn't just take their love, they took their wallets, and the session singers who had built the whole illusion were left standing alone in the wreckage, erased from a story they had sung to life. So before you assume that a scandal is just a feeling, remember this: the storm that follows isn't measured in tears, but in lawsuits, bankruptcies, and shattered lives. There is a strange genius in how Milli Vanilli pulled it off, a level of technical craft that most people never stop to consider. The Washington Post reported in 1990 that the duo performed live for thousands of fans, yet the voices booming from the speakers were coming from a reel-to-reel tape, perfectly synchronized to their lip movements. This wasn't a loose backing track, it was a meticulous choreography where every breath, every pause and every syllable had to match a physical performance happening in real time. The margin for error was microscopic, and a single misstep would have shattered the illusion in front of a stadium of witnesses. Fab Morvan later admitted in a 2021 Billboard interview that they lip-synced on major television programs like Saturday Night Live, a platform where technical failure is simply not an option. Think about the pressure of that, the sheer nerve required to stand on a stage broadcast to millions, knowing that your entire career rests on a tape machine not skipping a beat. This was the golden era of MTV, a point the New Yorker highlighted in 2019, where music videos became the dominant force in pop culture, shifting the focus entirely onto image and choreography. The constant rotation of visually stunning videos created a perfect smokescreen, making the studio recordings feel like a natural extension of the performers they saw dancing on their screens. The key to this entire deception, as noted by The Cut in 2021, was that Rob and Fab possessed the good looks and dance ability that the actual singers, Brad and John and Charles, simply did not have. Frank Farian knew he wasn't selling a band. He was selling a visual product, a fantasy that required a specific aesthetic to complete the package. The real artists were hidden away, their voices becoming the soul of a body that was never theirs, while the bodies they inhabited on screen were silent. Every step, every smile, every perfectly timed hip thrust was a calculated part of the performance, designed to make the lie not just believable, but unforgettable. Could you imagine maintaining that level of deception for even a single show, let alone a world tour? They didn't fool the world with their singing. They fooled it with a flawless visual spectacle that turned the art of sound into an afterthought. Charles Shaw never regretted stepping into that studio because it was a chance to live inside the music industry he loved. Yet the same hands that welcomed him also erased him completely. He was the man they called the voice of Rob Pilatus, the session singer who carried a multi-platinum album on his vocal cords while the world danced to a lie. But recognition never followed him, and he spoke openly about the bitterness of being treated like a ghost in the very machine he helped power. How does a man give his voice to history and still vanish from it without a trace? That ache of invisibility followed him long after the tape stopped spinning, and it deepened when his own body turned against him. Charles Shaw was diagnosed with terminal prostate cancer, a cruel final chapter for a man who had already spent decades fighting for a sliver of acknowledgement. The music charity Musicaris stepped in to cover his medical costs, a quiet mercy from an industry that had never learned to say his name aloud. He passed away on October 24, 2023, inside a hospice care facility in Phoenix, Arizona, at just 60 years old. The world barely paused, because the world had always known him as a footnote rather than a founder. He was the best singer they never saw, the man whose lungs gave life to a Grammy-winning project, while his own identity stayed locked in the shadows of a contract. The Guardian remembered him as a symbol of the voiceless workers behind pop's polished surface. But memory is a thin reward for a life spent in the dark. He died the way he lived, quiet, uncredited, and waiting for someone to finally ask who really sang those songs. The tragedy is not that he lost the fame, because he never had it to begin with. The tragedy is that his talent was used as currency to make others rich, while he got nothing but a secret. He left behind no fortune, no legacy of his own, only the echoes of melodies that millions hummed without ever knowing whose throat they came from. His story forces a question that still haunts the industry. If you can hear a voice but never see its owner, does that voice even exist? So when you listen to a live recording and compare it to the studio version, remember that the difference between them is not just technique, it is a whole person's life. Check the breath control, the slight imperfections, the way a real performance breathes with the crowd, because those are the fingerprints of a human being. Charles Shaw spent his final years watching his own voice get celebrated while his name was buried, and that silence is the loudest lesson of all. The voice that sold 7 million albums left the world with no one to mourn, and that is the real crime hidden inside the music. For decades the story seemed closed, a neatly filed cautionary tale about the excesses of the late 80s. But the scandal never truly ended. It just went quiet, waiting for the right moment to resurface with a new voice. The survivor of the duo, Fab Morvan, didn't disappear into bitterness. Instead, he re-emerged in the 2010s as an inspirational speaker, openly dissecting his own complicity and the hard-won lessons about truth he now carries. His willingness to confront the past turned a punchline into a story of flawed humanity trying to rebuild. The cultural engine kept turning, refusing to let the memory fade into a simple footnote of music history. By 2018, the saga had become so embedded in the public consciousness that it inspired both a stage musical and a documentary, proof that its strange appeal was far too potent to be forgotten. Then, on April 3, 2023, a definitive documentary premiered, chronicling the entire arc of the Rhine's Fall with fresh interviews from Fab and members of the Pilatus family. It was a formal high-definition reckoning, with a story that had once been told only through grainy news footage and tabloid headlines. The German production, titled The Girl You Know It's True, became a cultural artifact in its own right, framing the tale as a defining piece of German-American pop history. This wasn't just an American scandal anymore. It was a transatlantic drama, remembered on both sides of the ocean as a symbol of a particularly flashy, unguarded era. Watching Fab speak now, with the wisdom of hindsight, you have to wonder if the public's hunger to revisit this old wound is a search for catharsis or just a fascination with a beautiful disaster. The truth isn't a stone you can drop. It's a ghost that keeps asking for the stage, and the past is never as buried as we tell ourselves it is. The scandal forced a conversation the music industry wasn't ready to have, a debate about authenticity that feels even more urgent now that autotune can polish any note and backing tracks are the norm in arenas worldwide. By 2021, major stars were still facing accusations, with artists like Beyoncé and Taylor Swift questioned for relying on backing tracks and digitally enhanced lips during live performances, proving the issue never faded. Even back in the late 1980s, groups like New Kids on the Block and New Edition faced similar suspicions about whether every member was genuinely singing on stage. The problem wasn't isolated to Frank Farian's studio. It was woven into the fabric of pop stardom, where image often outsells authenticity. Look at the scale of Milli Vanilli's success, and you understand why the temptation was so immense, with Girl You Know It's True selling over 7 million copies in the US, and more than 30 million worldwide by 1991, earning multiple platinum certifications from the RIAA. Their singles dominated the Billboard charts, with Girl You Know It's True peaking at number 2, while Blame It on the Rain and Girl I'm Gonna Miss You both hit number 1 between 1989 and 1990. That level of commercial dominance creates a powerful incentive, making the risk of exposure seem worth it for a shot at immortality. The machinery of fame rewards the illusion so handsomely that the truth becomes an inconvenient obstacle rather than a moral imperative. The difference today is that technology has made the deception even harder to detect, as digital editing can fix a wavering vibrato or replace a missed cue in real time, blurring the line between live performance and studio perfection. When you watch a concert now, you can never be entirely sure if the voice you're hearing is coming from the throat on stage or from a hard drive in the sound booth. The tools have changed, but the underlying question remains. What exactly are you paying to see when you buy a ticket to a major tour? Are you witnessing raw talent or a highly polished product engineered for maximum profitability? This is where the warning sharpens into a stark reality, and the ethical lines that were drawn in the 90s have not moved. They have just become more convenient to ignore. If you are still lip-syncing through your sets or leaning on backing tracks so heavily that the live element is a cosmetic detail, you're not a performer, you're a spokesperson for a recording. That path leads directly to the same place it did for Frank Farian, a place where the artists become interchangeable parts and the music becomes a lie designed to move units. So the next time you watch a flawless performance, ask yourself whether the sweat and the breath you see are actually connected to the sound you hear. And remember what happens when the illusion finally breaks. When the Grammy was stripped away, Milli Vanilli didn't just disappear from the charts. They were carved into history as the definitive cautionary tale of manufactured fame, a case study so potent that it still anchors business ethics lectures everywhere, as noted by the Harvard Business Review in 2019. This scandal remains one of the most significant in Grammy history because it forced a reckoning with a fundamental question. Does the value of a recorded song outweigh the authenticity of a live performance? A question the Recording Academy itself has grappled with for decades. Before them, Frank Farian had already used session singers for Boney M, yet those vocalists were acknowledged, whereas Rob and Fab were a complete fabrication, a hollow vessel for other people's talent, as The Guardian clarified in 2024. So when we measure the cost of this deception, from the empty promises of stardom to the millions of dollars that changed hands, we have to ask ourselves, who actually pays the price for the lie we are conditioned to consume? Think about Min in Ho Chi Minh City, a singer whose voice you have probably heard hundreds of times on the radio, whose name you will likely never know, and who will never see a shred of the royalty checks that should rightfully bear his signature. He and countless others like him are the invisible engines of a music industry that often values a pretty face over a powerful pair of lungs, and their silent labour is the foundation upon which empires are built. They are the ones who are told to sign away their identity for a flat fee, while the world worships a manufactured image, and they are the ones who are erased from the very art they brought to life. If 68% of today's listeners have never even heard of Milli Vanilli, then we have to ask, Who is the real victim of a fraud that has been so completely forgotten? The lesson is not merely that lying is wrong, but that our culture has a music industry that is still built on a scaffolding of unpaid, uncredited, and unseen human effort. It is a call to look beyond the polished surface of a production, to listen for the real voices buried in the mix, and to finally recognize that behind every perfect product, there are always real people singing.